I was a navigator's apprentice aboard the Eternal Credence, and I believed I understood the warp. That was my first mistake. My last innocent thought before everything I knew became a lie wrapped in madness. The Eternal Credence was no grand vessel of the Imperial Navy, no cathedral ship bristling with lance batteries and conviction. She was a bulk hauler, 3 kilometers of riveted iron and desperation, her belly swollen with 70 million tons of grain tithes bound for hive worlds I would never see. I had made this journey 47 times before. 47 translations into the Immaterium, 47 successful navigations through the roiling madness between stars, guided by the Astronomican's holy light. The warp was dangerous, yes. Every child of the Imperium learns this before they learn to speak. But it was known danger. A catalogued and ritualized, bound by Geller Fields and the Emperor's grace. My master, Navigator Tertius Valdane, had made this run for 60 years. Her third eye, hidden beneath the ornate brass seal welded to her forehead, had stared into the warp for longer than I had been alive. She moved through the observation dome with the certainty of someone who had seen every horror the Immaterium could conjure and lived to file the appropriate reports. I worshipped her certainty the way others worshipped the Emperor, with desperate, absolute faith. The translation began normally. The ship's bells rang out in the sequence unchanged since the age of the Imperium's founding. 3 long peals, then 7 short, then the final toll that signified our passage from real space into the nightmare dimension that made faster than light travel possible. I felt the familiar lurch in my stomach, that sensation of falling sideways through a direction that shouldn't exist. The observation dome's shutters pulled back, revealing the warp beyond our Geller Field's protective bubble. I had seen it before. The colors that shouldn't be colors, the movements that made eyes water and thoughts scatter. The distant golden light of the Astronomican, the Emperor's psychic beacon shining from Holy Terra, cutting through the chaos like a lighthouse through fog. Beautiful and terrible and normal. Then the Geller Field flickered. It lasted perhaps a second, perhaps less. The air inside the observation dome suddenly smelled of copper and burnt hair. The temperature dropped so quickly that frost formed on my lips mid-breath. And in that heartbeat of vulnerability, something looked at me. I cannot describe what I saw. Human language fails. Human thought fails. Imagine being examined by something so vast that your entire existence, your memories, your hopes, your prayers to the Emperor, the very concept of you, is less than a single cell in its incomprehensible anatomy. Imagine being known by something that exists in more dimensions than you can perceive, something that sees you from angles that unmake geometry itself. It looked at me, and I looked back, and in that moment I understood with crystalline clarity that I had never truly seen the warp before. I had seen its surface, its mask, the lie it tells to those who navigate it. What I saw now was the truth beneath, and the truth was hungry. Navigator Valdane screamed. I had never heard her scream before. She clutched at the brass seal over her third eye as blood began weeping from beneath it, running down her face in streams that seemed to move against gravity, crawling upward toward the ceiling. The ship lurched, not forward or backward, but sideways, in a direction that my mind tried to reject even as I felt it in my bones. Alarms shrieked through the Vox system, the sound distorting into frequencies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Red emergency lighting flooded the observation dome, painting everything in shades of fresh blood. Outside the Geller Field, the warp was changing. The colors, those impossible, nameless colors, began to swirl in patterns that hurt to perceive. They formed shapes that suggested geometry, then biology, then concepts that had no physical form. Betrayal, hunger, inevitability. The Astronomican's light flickered in the distance, and for a moment I thought I saw it blink, as though Holy Terra itself was an eye, and that eye was closing. "We're caught," Valdane whispered, her voice broken and small. Blood continued to stream from beneath her seal, but she ignored it, her augmented eyes fixed on the nightmare outside. "Emperor, preserve us. We're caught in a storm." But it wasn't a storm. Not really. A storm implies chaos, random violence, nature's fury without purpose or thought. What pulled at the eternal credence was deliberate. I could feel its attention, its curiosity, its terrible patience. We hadn't stumbled into dangerous currents. We had been noticed. The ship groaned around us, metal screaming against forces it was never designed to withstand. I clutched the brass railing until my knuckles went white, praying to the Emperor with every scrap of faith I possessed. The prayers felt hollow in my mouth, the words slipping away like water through fingers, as though something was drinking them before they could reach their destination. "How long?" I managed to ask, my voice cracking. "How long until we break free?" Navigator Valdane turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before. Absolute, soul-crushing despair. "Time," she said softly, "doesn't work the same way anymore." The observation dome's instruments began spinning wildly. The chronometer's hands blurred into circular motion, then stopped, then began moving backward. The warp outside pressed against our Geller field like a living thing, patient and vast and impossibly aware. We were no longer traveling through the immaterium. We were drowning in it. The first thing to break was the chronometer in the observation dome, and with it, my ability to believe in cause and effect. I watched the brass hands spin backward through hours I had already lived, then lurch forward to dates that wouldn't arrive for months, then stop entirely on a time that read 99, 99, 99, an impossibility that nonetheless glowed steady and certain on the instrument face. Navigator Valdane ordered me to check the other timepieces throughout the ship. I found 17 chronometers across 3 decks. No two displayed the same reading. One insisted we had been in the warp for 4 minutes. Another claimed 6 centuries had passed. A third showed a date from before the Emperor walked Terra. The brass plate beneath it corroded with age that couldn't have accumulated in the decades since the ship's construction. I tried to maintain a schedule. The novice nobility had trained me in discipline, in the rituals that keep men sane in the face of the warp's madness. I marked each shift change in my personal journal, recording the passage of hours by my own internal sense of time. But when I looked back at my entries, the ink had changed color, from black to red, to something that looked like liquid silver. Words I had written appeared in handwriting that wasn't mine, describing events I had no memory of experiencing. One entry, dated tomorrow, described my death in precise detail. Killed by decompression in cargo hold 7. Body never recovered. Funeral held on a date that hasn't been invented yet. I tore out the page and burned it. The ashes reassembled themselves in my hand. Sleep became a form of temporal roulette. Like I would close my eyes in my cramped apprentice's quarters and wake to find myself in different sections of the ship. Once in the engineerium, surrounded by servitors who paused their work to stare at me with dead eyes. Once in a storage locker I knew had been sealed for the past 3 years. The air inside stale, and my uniform covered in dust that suggested I'd been there for weeks. The scars appeared gradually. A burn on my left hand from an accident I hadn't experienced yet. A surgical scar along my ribs that I discovered while bathing. The flesh around it still tender and new, though I had no memory of any injury or operation. The crew began to fracture across time's broken spine. I was walking through the main corridor toward the mess hall when I saw Deck Rating Corvus coming toward me. I knew Corvus, a reliable man, not 30 years in service, with a wife on some agri-world he spoke of constantly. He walked past me without acknowledgement, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Nothing unusual in that. But then I turned the corner and saw Corvus again, this time moving in the opposite direction, his uniform crisp and new, his face decades younger. As I watched, paralyzed, a third Corvus emerged from a side passage, this one ancient, bent with age, his skin hanging loose on his bones, moving with the shuffling gait of the dying. All 3 Corvuses walked past each other without reaction, as though this was normal, as though they each existed in separate streams of time that happened to intersect in the same corridor. I pressed myself against the bulkhead and prayed. The words of the Imperial Creed felt slippery in my mouth, like trying to hold water in my bare hands. Around me, I could hear the ship's bells ringing for shift changes, overlapping, contradictory, announcing meals and alarms, and all clears for events that were happening simultaneously in different whens. In the mess hall, I found Chief Engineer Sola eating breakfast, while the man next to her but older, her face lined with scars and despair, wept into her hands. Neither acknowledged the other. The older Sola's tears hit the table and ran upward, defying gravity, disappearing into the ventilation grates above. Several crew members sat eating meals that appeared and disappeared on their trays, the food cycling through states of fresh, consumed, and rotted in loops that made my stomach heave. "Is this happening to you too?" I asked the rating across from me, a young woman whose name I couldn't remember. She looked up at me with eyes that had aged 40 years, while her face remained youthful. "Is what happening?" she asked. "You just asked me that. Or you're about to. I can't remember which is which anymore." I tried to explain, but she interrupted me by placing her hand on mine, except her hand was both young and withered simultaneously. The flesh flickering between states like a pick screen with a failing connection. "It's worse when you sleep," she said. "Don't sleep. When you sleep, you come unstuck entirely." But I had to sleep. The human body demands it, even when reality itself has become negotiable. I returned to my quarters and bolted the door, though I no longer believed in the sanctity of locked spaces. I lay on my cot and closed my eyes, praying for dreamless darkness. I woke in the observation dome. Navigator Valdane stood before the viewing port, her back to me, blood still streaming from beneath her brass seal. Except now the blood flowed upward, climbing her face, disappearing into her hair. She was speaking, but the words came out backward, sounds that might have been low Gothic played in reverse. "Master," I called out, my voice echoing strangely. She turned. Her face was different, younger on the left side, ancient on the right, the division down the center of her nose so precise it looked surgical. "You're not here yet," she said, her words now comprehensible. "Or you've already left. I can't tell anymore. The warp is inside us now. Time is negotiable. How do we escape?" She laughed, and the sound made my bones ache. Escape implies a future different from the present. But the future is also the past here. We've already escaped. We're still trapped. Both are true. Neither are true. She turned back to the viewing port. Outside, the warp churned in patterns that suggested clocks melting, hourglasses running in both directions simultaneously, the concept of sequence itself coming undone. I looked down at my hands and saw them aging and youthing in rhythm with my heartbeat. Old, young, cycling through decades with each pulse of blood through my veins. The ship's bells, I said, desperate to cling to something concrete. How long has it been since we entered the storm? Navigator Valdane's reflection in the viewing port smiled with a mouthful of teeth that were both pristine and rotted. The bells have been ringing for eternity. They haven't started yet. Listen carefully. You can hear them announcing your birth and your death in the same tone. I listened. She was right. In the overlapping chaos of the bells, I could hear every moment of my life happening at once, compressed into a single eternal instant that was simultaneously forever and no time at all. I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound came out as prayer, and the prayer came out backward, and backward prayers in the warp are invitations. Something in the chaos outside heard me, and it laughed. The eternal credence began to remember things that had never happened, and forget things that were still occurring. I discovered this when I took a wrong turn on the way to the Medica deck, and found myself in a corridor that shouldn't exist. The ship's schematics were burned into my memory. 3 years of studying every passage, every bulkhead, every junction. I knew this vessel the way a priest knows his catechisms. But here was a hallway that stretched far beyond where the outer hull should be, lined with doors marked with departmental designations I'd never seen. Cargo hold 13, on a ship that only had 9 holds. Secondary bridge, when we'd never had a primary one. Chapel of Forgotten Saints, in stenciled Gothic that looked centuries old. I walked down that corridor because turning back felt more dangerous than going forward. The metal beneath my boots was wrong. Too smooth, too old, worn down by generations of foot traffic despite the ship being only 40 years out of the manufactorum. The air smelled of incense and rust, and something organic that made my throat close. Overhead, the lumen strips flickered in patterns that might have been code. Might have been seizure-inducing randomness. Might have been something trying to communicate in a language written in light. The first door I opened led to Cargo Hold 7. I knew Cargo Hold 7. I'd been there a dozen times, inspecting the grain shipments, checking the environmental seals. It was a rectangular space, 40 meters by 60, with mag-locked containers stacked in regulation patterns. This was not that hold. The space beyond the door stretched into impossible distances, the far walls lost in a darkness that the lumen strips couldn't penetrate. The containers were there, but they were arranged in geometries that hurt to perceive, stacked at angles that defied gravity, some of them occupying the same space simultaneously, their edges blurring together like watercolors in rain. I could see our cargo of grain in the transparent sections of some containers, but interspersed among them were containers marked with delivery dates from centuries past, and destinations that wouldn't be founded for centuries to come. I stepped inside. The door sealed behind me with a hiss that sounded like breathing. That's when I found the first body. It was lying between 2 containers, dressed in the uniform of a navigator's apprentice. My uniform. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run, but curiosity, That fatal human flaw drew me forward. The corpse was fresh, maybe dead a few hours. The blood pooled beneath it, still tacky and wet. The face was turned away, but I could see the apprentice's badge pinned to the chest, the same badge I wore. I knelt beside it and turned the face toward me. It was my face. See, my exact face. Not a twin, not a similar-looking crew member. Me. Down to the small scar on my left eyebrow from a childhood fall, the slight asymmetry of my nose, the specific pattern of stubble growth along my jaw. The corpse's eyes were open, clouded with death, staring at nothing. In its right hand was clutched a piece of paper. I pried it from the rigor-stiff fingers and unfolded it. The handwriting was mine. Don't trust the navigator. She died 3 days ago. The thing wearing her face is learning. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the note. I looked around the cargo hold, suddenly aware that I was alone with impossible geometry and my own corpse, and the temperature had dropped so low that my breath came out in clouds that fell upward instead of dispersing. I ran. The door had sealed, but it opened when I hit the release. And I stumbled back into the corridor, gasping. Behind me, I heard something moving in the hold. Something large. Something that breathed with the rhythm of cargo containers shifting in a storm. I found the second body in what should have been a supply locker. This corpse was older, weeks dead, maybe months. The flesh sunken and gray, the uniform rotted. But it was still me. The same face, now slack and decomposing. One eye eaten away by something that had left a trail of iridescent slime. This version of me had died violently. I could see the last burn through the chest, the edges of the wound cauterized and black. There was another note, this one pinned to the corpse's chest with a blade I recognized as coming from the ship's armory. The paper was yellow with age. The ink faded but still legible. The ship is alive. It's been alive since before we launched. We are the dream it's having. Wake up before it wakes up. I didn't run this time. I couldn't. My legs had stopped obeying my commands, locked in place by a terror so profound it had transcended mere physical fear and become something metaphysical. I stood there staring at my own rotting face, trying to understand how I could be both alive and dead, both here and there, both now and then. The third body I found by accident, stumbling into it in a darkened junction where 3 corridors met at angles that added up to more than they should. This version of me was ancient, decades dead, the corpse mummified, the skin like leather stretched over bones. The uniform had fused with the flesh, becoming indistinguishable from it. There was no note this time. All but carved into the bulkhead above the corpse were words scratched with what might have been fingernails. It remembers forward. I heard footsteps behind me and spun around to find Chief Engineer Sulla standing there, her face expressionless. Not the young Sulla, not the old one, something in between, her features shifting subtly as I watched, aging and youthing in microscopic increments. "You've seen them too," she said. It wasn't a question. "The bodies, my bodies, I don't understand." "The ship remembers what we forget," Sulla interrupted, "and it forgets what we remember. Time doesn't flow here, it pools. We're living in all our moments simultaneously, and the ship is recording all of them, even the ones that haven't happened yet, even the ones that will never happen at all." "That's impossible." She smiled, and her teeth were there, then gone, then back, flickering in and out of existence. "We had this conversation yesterday. We'll have it again tomorrow. I've seen your corpses too, dozens of them, scattered throughout the ship. I've seen my own. 17 times, I've found myself dead in 17 different ways. She leaned closer, and I could smell ozone and something sweet like overripe fruit. Want to know the worst part? I didn't, but I nodded anyway. Some of the corpses are still alive. They blink, they breathe, they just can't move, can't speak, trapped in bodies that are simultaneously living and dead. I found myself, a me, in the engineerium yesterday, or tomorrow. She was wedged between two plasma conduits, burned beyond recognition but still conscious, still aware. Her eyes followed me as I walked past. I couldn't help her. I can't help anyone. I can't even help myself. Behind Sulla, I saw movement. The corridor was filling with crew members, but something was wrong with them. They walked through each other like ghosts, occupying the same space, their bodies transparent and overlapping. I recognized faces, Corvus, the ratings, the Medica, all of them moving in different directions, different times, different realities that somehow coexisted in the same hallway. The ship groaned around us, metal singing in frequencies that sounded almost like words, almost like hymns, almost like screaming. From deeper in the vessel came a sound that might have been the engineerium, might have been the waste processors, might have been something else entirely. A rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat, like machinery, like a combination of both that suggested something vast and organic and mechanical had begun growing in the ship's depths. We should go back to our posts, Sulla said, already walking away, her form becoming transparent, then solid, then transparent again as she moved through the overlapping crew members. We've always been at our posts. We've never left them. Both are true. I stood alone in the junction, or not alone, surrounded by temporal echoes of my crew, all of us existing in the same space but different whens, and felt the ship remember something about me. In that moment of remembering, I ceased to exist for 3 heartbeats, then returned to find myself standing somewhere else entirely, with no memory of how I'd gotten there, holding a tool I'd never seen before, my hands covered in someone else's blood. That the ship's bells rang out, announcing events that had already occurred and hadn't yet begun, and in the spaces between the tones, I heard my own voice screaming from a distance that might have been spatial or temporal, or something that was neither and both. The eternal credence had become a graveyard of moments, and we were all buried in it, alive. Madness came for us the way rot comes for fruit, from the inside out, softening our minds until they collapsed under their own weight. Captain Heredis was the first to demonstrate the new order of things. I found him on the command deck, surrounded by his senior officers, conducting an execution. Rating Michael knelt before him, hands bound behind his back with wire that had cut deep enough to expose bone. The captain read the charges in a voice that never wavered, never showed doubt. Ataizbi, for the crime of sabotaging the Geller Field relays on the 19th day of next month, for the murder of Navigator Valdane 3 weeks ago tomorrow, and for the future betrayal you will commit in 6 days that haven't been scheduled yet, I sentence you to immediate execution. May the Emperor have mercy on your soul across all the timelines in which you possess one. Mikhail was weeping, stammering protests. I haven't done any of that. I would never. I'm loyal, Captain. I swear on Terra itself. You will do it, the captain said with absolute certainty. I've seen the reports. I filed them myself yesterday. The Administratum has already processed your death certificate. The funeral was beautiful. You would have appreciated the hymns we sang over your corpse. He pulled his bolt pistol and fired. Michael's head exploded in a spray of bone and brain matter that hung in the air for a moment before falling upward, splattering across the ceiling. The body remained kneeling for several seconds, then toppled sideways, blood pooling around it in defiance of gravity, flowing into patterns that looked disturbingly like low Gothic script. "Promote him," the captain said to his first officer. "He'll do better in his next position." The first officer, a man named Karras who had served for 20 years, nodded and made a notation on his data slate. He stepped over Mikhail's corpse, which was now twitching, the ruined head attempting to regenerate, flesh crawling across exposed skull like maggots, failing, trying again in an endless loop of incomplete resurrection. "Corvus," the captain called out. "Just step forward." I watched as 3 versions of Corvus responded, the young one, the middle-aged one, the ancient one. All 3 stepped forward simultaneously, their bodies occupying overlapping space, creating a composite figure that hurt to perceive directly. The captain addressed all 3 as though this was normal. "You're promoted to second engineer. Congratulations. Your predecessor died in the position last week. You'll fill it admirably until you die in it tomorrow. Report to your station immediately." All 3 Corvuses saluted, their arms moving at different speeds, creating a fan of motion that lasted too long. They turned and walked away, their footsteps echoing in patterns that suggested 1 person, 3 people, and something in between. The madness spread like a plague, but calling it a plague implied something external. It's something that infected from outside. This came from within, as though the warp had seeped through the hull and settled into our minds like sediment in standing water. I found 2 crew members, ratings whose names I'd forgotten, embracing in a corridor near the crew quarters. At first, I thought nothing of it. Even in the depths of madness, humans seek comfort in touch. But as I watched, their embrace tightened, intensified, their bodies pressing together with strength that suggested desperation or violence or both. Their flesh began to merge. It happened slowly at first, where their hands clasped, the skin blurred together, the boundary between them becoming indistinct. Then faster, arms fusing, chests collapsing into each other, bones liquefying and reforming, faces pressing together and merging into a single screaming visage with 2 mouths, 4 eyes, features scattered across a surface that was both 1 face and 2. The thing that had been 2 people stood there swaying, its multiple mouths speaking in overlapping voices. "Emperor, preserve us. Emperor, help us. We are 1, we are 2, we are neither, please. Make it stop. We can't stop. We won't stop. This is mercy. This is horror. We are unbecoming. Help us forget us. Remember us." I ran. Behind me, I heard the thing shambling after me, its footsteps irregular, too many legs, too many joints, the sound of flesh slapping against metal in rhythms that suggested dance, or seizure, or prayer. In the medic bay, I found Dr. Hellfast treating patients who no longer moved. They sat on examination tables, stood against walls, lay on gurneys, frozen in place like statues carved from living flesh. Their eyes tracked movement. Tears ran down some faces, but they couldn't speak, couldn't gesture, couldn't scream despite the obvious terror in their expressions. "What happened to them?" I asked. Hellfast didn't look up from his work, injecting one of the frozen crew members with a stim that had no effect. "They stopped," he said simply. Time moved forward for them, and then just stopped. They exist in a single moment now, conscious but unable to progress to the next instant. I've declared them dead, but they won't die. I've filed the death certificates, held the funerals, recycled their belongings. But they remain trapped, aware. Can you help them? I am helping them. He moved to the next frozen figure, a young woman whose mouth was open in a silent scream, her hands raised as if warding off something terrible. He checked her vitals with instruments that gave readings and colors that didn't exist. I've been helping them for 3 days. I'll continue helping them for the next 6 months, all simultaneously. Time is negotiable, apprentice. I treat patients who died yesterday and will be born tomorrow. It's all the same to the Emperor's mercy. He paused, finally looking at me with eyes that had cataracts on one side and were perfectly clear on the other. You should leave. In approximately 4 minutes, I'm going to begin eating my own and I've already started. I won't stop until I've consumed myself entirely. I need to file the reports in triplicate before I finish. The administratum is very particular about documentation of self-cannibalization. You're insane. Yes, he agreed pleasantly. We all are. The only difference is that I'm aware of it, and you're still pretending you're not. He raised his right hand and examined it with clinical detachment. It will taste like pork, I think. I've already tasted it in the future. The reports are quite detailed. I fled the medic bay as Dr. Hellfast brought his hand to his mouth and bit down with the methodical precision of a man conducting a scientific experiment on himself. Behind me, I heard the wet sounds of tearing flesh and the scratch of a stylus on parchment as he simultaneously consumed himself and documented the process. The mess hall had become a theater of temporal collapse. See, crew members sat eating meals that appeared on their trays fully cooked, then cycled backward through preparation to raw ingredients, then forward again to consumption, the food existing in all states simultaneously. One rating was eating and vomiting and eating again in a perfect loop, his expression cycling through pleasure, disgust, and confusion with each iteration. Master of Vox Talis sat alone at a corner table, surrounded by a pile of his own fingers. As I watched, he picked up a fork with his left hand, which had all 5 fingers intact, and calmly speared his right index finger with the tines. He cut through the joint with a knife, the bone parting with a sound like breaking ceramic. Blood welled up, then flowed backward into the wound, then forward again, the temporal loop making it impossible to tell if he was being injured or healing. He placed the severed finger on his plate and began to eat it, cutting it into small pieces, chewing methodically. Between bites, he spoke into his Vox recorder, his voice steady and professional. Hour mark indeterminate. Subject continues self-consumption experiment. Taste is adequate. Texture somewhat chewy. Recommend accompanying with recaf, though recaf may not exist anymore, or may have always existed. Filing report in triplicate. First copy for the captain, second copy for the administratum, third copy for the entity that will replace me when I've finished consuming myself, which I have already done, which I am currently doing, which I will do. He looked up at me, his face calm despite half of it being covered in his own blood. Would you like to join me? I've saved you a finger from yesterday, or tomorrow. Time is negotiable, but hospitality is eternal. I backed away slowly, my gorge rising. Around me, the crew continued their routines, eating, working, dying, living, all states occurring simultaneously, all timelines collapsing into a single eternal present that was also an eternal past and an eternal future. Through the Vox system, I heard the captain making announcements. His voice was layered now, speaking multiple sentences simultaneously, giving orders that contradicted and complemented each other, announcing deaths of people still walking, promotions of corpses, celebrations of disasters, mourning for victories yet to occur. In the corridors, crew members walked through each other, merged with each other, froze in place, or simply ceased to exist for moments at a time before reappearing elsewhere, their continuity shattered. The ship's bells rang continuously now, a cacophony of overlapping tones announcing every possible event simultaneously. Births, deaths, meals, prayers, alarms, all clears, shifts, changes, battles, surrenders, beginnings, endings, until the sound became a texture, a weight, a presence that pressed against my skull and made thought difficult. I found myself in my quarters, though I had no memory of walking there. My hands were covered in blood that might have been mine, or someone else's, or everyone's. On the wall, someone had written in what looked like burned flesh, "Sanity is the luxury of linear time." I laughed, and the laughter came out as screaming, and the screaming came out as prayer. And the prayer came out as something else entirely. A sound that had no name in any human language. A noise that existed before language was invented and would persist after language had been forgotten. Outside my door, I heard the merged crew thing shambling past, its multiple mouths singing hymns in discordant harmony. Somewhere in the distance, Dr. Hellfast was still eating himself and filing reports. Captain Heredis was executing people for crimes they hadn't committed yet and promoting their corpses. The frozen crew members stood in their eternal instance, aware and trapped and unable to die. And I sat in my quarters, watching my hands age and youth with each heartbeat, feeling my sanity peel away in layers like skin after a burn. Knowing that madness had already taken me, was currently taking me. It would eventually take me, all simultaneously true, in a reality where time had become negotiable and sanity was the first currency we'd spent. The eternal credence sailed on through the warp storm, carrying a crew that had ceased to be human in any meaningful sense, becoming instead something new, something that existed in all moments at once, something that remembered forward and forgot backward, something that prayed in screams and screamed in prayers. We had unraveled, and in our unraveling, we had become something that should never have existed, but we did exist. We do exist. We will exist, all at once, forever, never. We were not alone anymore. We had never been alone. We would always be alone. All three statements were true, and the contradictions made my teeth ache. I first saw one of them on the 3rd day, or the 15th year, or the moment before we entered the storm. Time had become a meaningless metric, but my mind still tried to impose sequence on the chaos, because without sequence, there could be no narrative. And without narrative, there could be no sanity. And sanity was something I clung to even as it slipped through my fingers like smoke. It wore Rating Corvus's face. Not one of the 3 Corvuses I'd seen before. Not the young one, not the middle-aged one, not the ancient one. This was something wearing the idea of Corvus, the concept of him rendered in flesh that was almost right but fundamentally wrong, in ways that made my hindbrain scream warnings my conscious mind struggled to articulate. The shadows fell in the wrong directions. The thing stood beneath a lumen strip. Harsh, white light beating down on it. But its shadow stretched toward the light source instead of away from it. And there were too many shadows. 3, 4, 7 of them, each pointing in impossible directions. Some of them moving independently of the body that cast them. It spoke, and the words arrived before the mouth moved. Apprentice, I've been looking for you. I need to discuss the grain shipment reports from the hold. There are discrepancies in the manifest. I pressed myself against the corridor wall, my heart hammering. Corvus is on duty in the engine room. All three of him. The thing smiled, and the smile was perfect. Exactly the way Corvus smiled, slightly crooked, the left side pulling up more than the right. I've just come from there, or I'm about to go there. The engineer needed my assistance with the plasma conduits. They're leaking temporal radiation. Or they will be, or they've always been leaking, and we're only noticing now because the leaking is happening backward through time. Everything it said was technically coherent. The words made sense individually, but strung together they created a wrongness that made my skin crawl. "Show me your identification," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It reached into its uniform pocket and produced papers that looked authentic. The Imperial Aquila watermarked into the parchment, the correct stamps and seals, Corvus's service number printed in regulation font. The documentation was perfect. Too perfect. The paper wasn't worn at all, despite supposedly being handled daily for years. The ink was precisely the right shade of black, not faded by time or handling. "Everything is in order," the thing said. I say its voice carrying harmonics that shouldn't exist in human speech, frequencies above and below normal range, creating phantom words in the spaces between the real ones. "I'm who I've always been. I'll be who I'll always be. There's nothing to concern yourself with." It walked past me, and as it did, I smelled something beneath the usual ship odors of recycled air and machine oil, something organic and wrong, like flowers rotting in standing water, like meat sweetening in heat, like the smell of the warp itself, if the warp could have an odor. I watched it walk down the corridor, and its footsteps echoed wrong, arriving before the foot hit the deck, lingering after it lifted, creating rhythms that suggested multiple gates overlapping. After that, I saw them everywhere. They wore the faces of the crew, carried the correct identification, performed their duties with perfect precision. But they were helpful in ways that humans weren't helpful, anticipating needs before they were spoken, appearing in places they couldn't have reached in time, knowing things they had no way of knowing. I was in the observation dome when one wearing Navigator Valdane's face approached me. The real Valdane had locked herself in her sanctum 3 days ago, or 3 years, or 3 minutes, and hadn't emerged. But here stood something with her face, her posture, her mannerisms. "You're troubled," it said with Valdane's voice. But the words echoed before they were spoken, as though the sound traveled backward from the future. "I can help you understand what's happening to us. You're not the Navigator. I am exactly the Navigator. I'm more the Navigator than she is. She's forgotten what she's supposed to be. I remember perfectly." It gestured to the viewing port, where the warp churned in patterns that suggested eyes opening, mouths forming, attention focusing. "We're inside something vast, apprentice, something that's been dreaming since before the Imperium existed. We passed through the surface of its dream, and now we're in the deeper layers. The ship, the crew, everything we think we are, we're thoughts in a sleeping god's mind. That's heresy. Truth often is." The thing smiled with Valdane's mouth, but too many teeth showed, and they were arranged in patterns that suggested bilateral symmetry that humans didn't possess. "But I'm not here to philosophize. I'm here to help. The plasma conduits in Section 7 are going to fail tomorrow, or they failed yesterday. I've prepared the repair schedule. You just need to sign off on it." It held out a data slate. The screen showed detailed technical schematics, repair protocols, timing sequences. Everything was correct, thorough, exactly what a proper repair schedule should look like. How did you know the conduits would fail? Because I repaired them before they broke. Time is negotiable. Cause and effect are suggestions. I'm simply being efficient. The thing's eyes, Valdane's eyes, but with something ancient swimming behind them, fixed on me with an intensity that made my bladder clench. Sign the schedule. Accept my help. It's what I'm here for. What I've always been here for. What I'll always be here for. I signed. Emperor, forgive me, I signed. Because the alternative was to refuse help that might keep the ship functional, might keep us alive, might offer some hope of escape. And in that moment of weakness, I invited it deeper into our reality. The things multiplied after that. Or perhaps they'd always been there, and I'd simply started seeing them. They worked the engineering stations alongside the real crew. They filed reports in the administratum offices. They served food in the mess hall. Meals that tasted right but felt wrong. Nourishment that sustained the body while somehow starving the soul. I watched one of them, wearing the face of a rating named Dulles, disassemble another crew member's family. Not kill them. Disassemble them. It stood in the crew quarters, speaking in Dulles's voice, explaining in calm, reasonable tones how the man's wife and children had never existed, how the photographs on the wall showed empty frames, how the letters from home had always been blank pages, how memory itself was unreliable in the warp, and perhaps the family had been a comforting fiction the man had created to endure the loneliness of void service. But I remember them. The crew member sobbed, clutching photographs that flickered between showing smiling faces and empty backgrounds. I remember my daughter's laugh, my wife's voice. They're real. They have to be real. They are real, the thing said gently, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. They're real in the timeline where they existed. But we're in a different timeline now. In this one, they never were. Both are true. You're mourning people who lived full lives and never existed. The grief is valid either way. The crew member collapsed, cradling photographs of ghosts, keening in a language that might have been low Gothic, or might have been the raw sound of a mind breaking. The thing wearing Dulles's face petted his head with something that might have been compassion, or might have been the way a farmer soothes livestock before slaughter. Some of the crew began to worship them. I found the shrines in the waste reclamation chambers, erected in the spaces where human refuse was processed and recycled. The altars were made of pipes and wire, decorated with offerings that made my gorge rise. Fingers, teeth, hair, pieces of uniform, photographs of loved ones, written prayers that bled when touched. A dozen crew members knelt before the largest shrine, their voices raised in hymns that were almost imperial hymnals, but subtly wrong. The words shifted just enough to praise things that shouldn't be praised. As I watched from the shadows, one of the things walked among them. This one wearing no specific face, its features shifting between different crew members with each step, becoming a composite of everyone and no one. You honor us with your devotion, it said, and its voice was every voice, overlapping and harmonizing. We are here to help. We have always been here to help. Before you called us, we answered. After you forget us, we'll still remember you. One of the worshippers, I recognized her as a deck officer named Syria, looked up with eyes that reflected light that wasn't there. What do you want from us? Nothing. Everything. Your continuation. your transformation. Your prayers taste like starlight, and we are hungry for illumination." The thing placed its shifting hand on Saria's head. "Like, we want to help you become what you're going to be, what you've always been, what you can never stop being." Where its hand touched her, Saria's hair turned white, then black, then a color that had no name, cycling through shades that didn't exist in normal spectrum. She gasped, and the sound was pleasure and horror and religious ecstasy all compressed into a single exhalation. The worshippers began to chant, and the chant made the walls weep fluids that defied identification. Too thick to be water, too thin to be oil, clear and viscous and somehow aware, pooling on the floor and forming shapes that suggested faces, hands, eyes opening and closing in the surface tension. The processed sewage in the reclamation tanks began to move with purpose, forming structures, creating patterns, building tiny architectures of waste that shouldn't be able to hold shape but did, defying every law of physics and sanitation. In the heart of the largest structure, something small and terrible opened an eye and looked at me. I fled, but the things were everywhere now, in the corridors, in the quarters, in every section of the ship, helpful, efficient, anticipating needs, offering comfort that felt like razors dragging through the soul. And the worst part, the part that made me want to claw my own eyes out, was that we needed them. They kept the ship running. They filed the reports. They prevented disasters before they happened, or after they happened, or during the eternal moment when they were always happening. Without them, we would have already died. Without them, we were already dead. Without them, we would never die, because we would be trapped in the moment of dying forever. From her sanctum, I could hear Navigator Valdane screaming. She'd been screaming for days, or years, or since before time began. The sounds came through the reinforced door in waves, wordless, primal. The sound of someone who'd seen something that broke the part of the mind that processes visual information and left only raw, unfiltered horror. She saw it. One of the things said. It stood beside me, wearing the chief engineer's face. The eye that opened in the warp. The thing that's dreaming us. She looked at it directly with her third eye, and it looked back. And now she can't stop seeing. Even when she closes all her eyes, it's still there, behind her eyelids, inside her skull. I'm showing her what we're becoming. What are we becoming? The thing smiled with Sulla's mouth. Useful, transformed, saved, damned, help and helped, all of it, none of it. Does it matter? We're here to assist you. We've always been here to assist you. Let us help. It offered its hand, and I saw that beneath the skin, something else moved. Geometries that shouldn't fit inside human flesh. Structures that suggested bone but weren't bone. Weren't anything that should exist in three-dimensional space. I didn't take the hand, but I didn't refuse it either. I simply stood there, paralyzed by indecision, while around me the things that wore our faces continued their helpful work, their terrible kindness, their compassionate destruction of everything that made us human. And from the waste reclamation chambers, the worshippers' prayers grew louder, their devotion feeding something that had been starving since before stars burned, something that had been patient for eternities, something that had finally found a congregation desperate enough to believe that their damnation was salvation. The things came when called, but we had never called them. Or we had always been calling them, or they had called us into being, and we were the answer to prayers we didn't remember speaking. All were true, none were true. The contradictions ate at my sanity like acid. And still, the things smiled with our faces and offered their help. And we accepted because the alternative was to face the horror alone. And facing the horror alone meant admitting we were already lost. The grain began whispering on the 14th day. Or perhaps it had always been whispering, and we had only just learned to hear it. I was walking past Cargo Hold 4 when I first noticed a sound like wind through wheat fields, like thousands of tiny voices murmuring just below the threshold of comprehension. I pressed my ear against the sealed door, and the sound resolved into something almost like words, almost like prayers, almost like breathing. The door was warm. Cargo holds were kept cold to preserve the grain, maintain freshness for the hive worlds that would receive it. But the metal beneath my palm radiated heat like living flesh, and I could feel a rhythm through it, slow, steady, the pulse of something vast and patient. I opened the door. The first rule of void travel is never open a cargo hold without proper authorization and safety protocols. But rules had stopped meaning anything when time stopped being linear. I opened the door because the whispering wanted me to, and resistance felt like swimming against a tide that had already pulled me under. The hold was exactly as it should be. Mag-locked containers stacked in regulation patterns, environmental controls displaying correct temperatures and humidity levels, everything ship-shape and proper. But the air that rolled out was wrong. Too warm, too humid, carrying the sweet-rot smell of organic decay, and the underneath scent of something growing. The containers were transparent on one side for inspection purposes. I could see the grain inside, golden and perfect, each kernel identical to every other, blessed by the Mechanicus and sanctified for transport. 70 million tons of it, enough to feed a hive city for a month. It was moving, not the stirring of cargo shifting in transit, not the settling of bulk material. This was purposeful movement, the grain flowing in currents inside the sealed containers, creating patterns, forming structures. As I watched, the kernels arranged themselves into shapes that suggested eyes, mouths, hands reaching toward the transparent walls. A face formed in the grain nearest me. Human features rendered in thousands of individual kernels, each one perfectly positioned to create the illusion of flesh and bone. The face was no one I recognized, but it was watching me, its grain eyes tracking my movement with impossible precision. Then it smiled, and the smile was made of hunger. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to seal the hold and never return. But I was transfixed. I'm watching as more faces formed in the containers, hundreds of them, thousands, each one different, each one smiling that same terrible smile. The whispering grew louder, resolving into words I could almost understand. They spoke in a language that might have been Low Gothic, or might have been something older, something that humans spoke before the Imperium, before Terra, before language itself evolved from animal grunts into coherent communication. Hungry, the voices whispered. So hungry. Feed us. Let us feed you. We have been waiting so long, so long. Time is food. Space is food. Flesh is food. Everything is food. We will feed everyone. Everyone will feed us. The cycle completes. The hunger satisfies. The satisfaction hungers. I backed away slowly, and the faces in the grain followed my movement, rotating in their containers. Fit the kernels flowing like liquid to maintain the illusion of tracking eyes. One of the things wearing a crew member's face appeared beside me. I hadn't heard it approach. They never made sound when they moved anymore, as though they'd learned to slip between the moments when noise occurred. "The cargo is restless," it said with Rating Dullus's voice. "It's been speaking more frequently. Some of the crew have begun answering. It's just grain. It can't speak. It can't think. It's agricultural product, blessed and sanctified. It's all of those things. And it's also alive. It's been alive since before it was planted. The seeds remembered being wheat, being grass, being the first plants that crawled from primordial seas. They remember everything, and they're tired of being eaten without eating back." The thing gestured to the containers. "Eat." They're learning, growing, evolving. The warp is an excellent teacher for those patient enough to listen. This is madness. Yes, it's also the truth. Both can coexist. The thing smiled with Dullus's mouth. "You should leave. In approximately 3 minutes, the grain in Container 47 will breach its seal. It will be looking for new places to grow." I ran. Behind me, I heard the container burst open, the sound of metal tearing, of grain spilling out in a cascading rush that hit the deck with the sound of rain, of locusts, of 1,000 small bodies moving with unified purpose. The next day, or the previous month, or the moment that had been happening continuously since we entered the storm, I found grain growing in the mess hall. It sprouted from the cracks between deck plates, a golden stalks pushing through metal that shouldn't yield, that couldn't yield, yet did. The crew stepped around it unseeing or uncaring, eating their rations while wheat grew from the floor, from the walls, from the ceiling. Some stalks had reached maturity, heavy heads of grain bowing under their own weight, shedding kernels that hit the floor, and immediately began growing. The life cycle compressed into minutes, into seconds, into the eternal instant where everything happened simultaneously. I found it growing in my own quarters. My cot was covered in it, stalks emerging from the thin mattress, roots digging into the metal frame, grain heads hanging over where my head rested each night. I tore at it, pulling up handfuls of wheat, but the stalks regrew instantly, emerging from the same holes, as though the plant and the ship had merged. I'd become one organism with two forms. There was grain in my hair. I felt it while running my hands over my head, tiny kernels tangled in the strands, and when I pulled them out, I saw they'd taken root in my scalp. Tiny filaments of root structure penetrating skin, drawing nourishment from my blood. I screamed and clawed at my head, pulling out wheat and hair together. But I could feel more of it inside, beneath the skin, in my sinuses, pressing against the back of my eyes. In the Medica Bay, Dr. Hellfast examined me with what remained of his hands. He'd consumed up to his wrists now, the stumps cauterized and bandaged. But he'd adapted, holding his instruments between his forearms with disturbing dexterity. "Interesting," he said, peering into my ears with a scope. "You've got significant root growth in your eustachian tubes. Is some early grain head formation in your left sinus cavity. I'd estimate you're about 40% colonized. Another few days and you'll reach critical mass." Critical mass of what? Becoming part of the harvest. He made notations on his data slate, balancing it on his forearm. The grain is learning to grow in new mediums. Flesh is much more nutrient-rich than soil. Some crew members are already producing viable grain from their bodies. It's quite remarkable from a botanical perspective. From a medical perspective, it's absolutely horrific. Both perspectives are valid. He showed me his data slate. Picked captures of crew members in various stages of colonization. Grain growing from eye sockets. stalks emerging from mouths, entire torsos split open by wheat growth, the organs pushed aside to make room for agricultural expansion. Can you remove it? I could, I won't. It's already too integrated with your nervous system. Removal would require removing significant portions of your brain. You'd cease being you. Although one could argue you're already ceasing being you and becoming something new, something useful, something that will feed others. He smiled with a mouth that had too few teeth, having eaten most of them yesterday. Don't worry, the transformation is quite painless, or excruciatingly painful. Time is negotiable, so pain is too. You'll experience all possible pain states simultaneously, which averages out to no pain at all. Or infinite pain. Mathematics becomes philosophical in the warp. I fled the Medicaid Bay as Hellfast returned to consuming himself, now working on his left forearm, eating with methodical precision while filing reports with stumps that somehow still held styluses. The grain was everywhere now. I found it in the engine room, growing from plasma conduits, stalks wrapped around control levers, roots digging into circuit boards. The chief engineer, the real one, not one of the things, stood before a control panel that was more wheat than machinery, trying to coax functionality from systems that had become agricultural. "It's improving efficiency," she said without looking at me. Her voice was dreamy, distant. "The grain conducts energy better than copper. The roots form superior circuit pathways. We're running at 140% capacity." 140% of what? I'm not certain anymore, but the numbers are impressive. I could see grain growing from her uniform. Kernels nestled in the fabric, stalks emerging from her collar. When she turned, I saw her back was covered in wheat, the stalks emerging from her spine, roots visible beneath her skin like dark veins. "You're infected," I said. "Colonized," she corrected. "There's a difference. Infection implies damage. This is symbiosis. I feed the grain feeds me. I'm more efficient now. I process information faster. I can feel the ship systems through the root networks. We're merging, ship, crew, cargo, all becoming one organism. It's beautiful. It's horrible. It's both." She smiled, and I saw grain growing between her teeth. In the corridors, I passed crew members who had progressed further in their transformation. One man had grain growing from his eye sockets, the stalks emerging where his eyes had been, to the kernels hanging where tears should fall. He navigated by touch, feeling along the walls, humming hymns while his wheat eyes swayed with movements of air currents. A woman sat against a bulkhead, her abdomen split open, wheat growing from her intestines, roots wrapped around her organs, grain heads emerging from her navel like a grotesque bouquet. She was eating her rations, and I watched the food travel down her throat, get processed by organs tangled in roots, the nutrients flowing into the grain that was consuming her from the inside out. "It doesn't hurt," she said when she noticed me staring. "It sings. Can you hear it? The grain sings in frequencies below hearing, and the song is about hunger and harvest, and the cycle of consumption. We eat the grain eats us, everyone feeds everyone. It's the perfect economy. Say the administratum would be pleased. No waste, complete efficiency." I coughed, and kernels came up expelled from my lungs. I'd breathed them in somehow, or they'd grown there, sprouted in the warm, wet darkness of my respiratory system. I coughed again, harder, and brought up a small spray of grain and blood, the kernels glistening red, still viable, already beginning to sprout in the pooled fluid on the deck. The things that wore our faces gathered around the sprouting grain, watching with interest. "You're producing well," one of them said with Navigator Valdane's voice. "Your yield will be acceptable, perhaps not enough to feed a hive city, but enough to feed us. And we are always hungry, have always been hungry, will always be hungry." "What are you?" I demanded, backing away, coughing up more grain. "We are the things that help, the things that hunger, the things that were invited when you entered the storm." It knelt beside the sprouting grain, touching the tiny stalks with something that might have been reverence. "We are also the grain, have always been the grain that humans plant and harvest and eat and shit and return to soil over and over for millennia. Did you think we didn't notice? Did you think we didn't remember? Did you think we didn't dream of growing in richer soil?" It looked up at me with Valdane's eyes, but behind them swam vegetable intelligence, plant consciousness, the patient awareness of organisms that measure time in seasons and generations. "You are the richer soil, your flesh, your blood, your bone, perfect growing medium. And when you're fully colonized, when the grain has consumed you entirely, you'll be the harvest. And the harvest will be planted in new soil, and the cycle will continue. Farmer becomes field, becomes crop, becomes meal, becomes fertilizer, becomes field, becomes farmer. The circle closes. The hunger satisfies. The satisfaction hungers. I ran, leaving a trail of grain kernels that fell from my clothes, my hair, my coughing mouth. Behind me, the things gathered the fallen kernels like sacraments, planting them in the walls, the floor. The bodies of crew members who had stopped moving become statues of flesh, serving as planters for agricultural expansion. I sealed myself in my quarters, but the grain was already there, growing from every surface, and I could feel it growing inside me. Roots spreading through my circulatory system, stalks pressing against the underside of my skin, seeking light, seeking air, seeking the harvest that I was becoming. In the cargo holds, the containers burst one by one, spilling grain that flowed through the ship like tides, like blood, like the thoughts of something vast and patient that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. We had been carrying the grain, but the grain had been carrying something else, and that something was hungry, had always been hungry, would feast on us until we became it, and it became us, and the distinction ceased to matter in the eternal cycle of consumption. I coughed, and wheat grew from my mouth, and I knew my harvest was approaching. We returned to real space on a date that had never existed, in a location that contradicted the laws of celestial mechanics, welcomed by a world that had died 4,000 years before we were born. The transition was violent. At one moment we were drowning in the warp's endless now, the grain singing in our veins, time flowing in all directions simultaneously. The next, reality snapped back into place with a sound like bones breaking, like prayers being answered by something that wasn't the Emperor, like the universe itself screaming in protest at our continued existence. I was in the observation dome when it happened. I'd been there for 3 days or 3 seconds. Duration had lost meaning. Navigator Valdane's sanctum had finally gone silent. The screaming had stopped 12 hours ago, or would stop in 6 years, or had never begun. The silence was worse than the screaming. Silence implied something had ended, and endings required linear time. And linear time was a lie we'd forgotten how to believe. The warp outside the Geller field simply stopped. The roiling colors, the impossible geometries, the eyes that watched from angles that shouldn't exist. All of it froze mid-motion, like a pict capture, like a painting, like a memory of movement rather than movement itself. Then it shattered. Reality broke through like fists through glass, fragments of the warp falling away into nothing, into everywhere, into the spaces between spaces where discarded nightmares go to die. And beyond the breaking storm, I saw stars. Real stars. Fixed points of light that didn't blink or breathe or hunger. Stars that followed the laws of physics, that burned through nuclear fusion rather than malice. That existed in 3 dimensions rather than 7 or 17, or the infinite dimensions the warp had shown us. I wept. Emperor, forgive me. I wept like a child, tears streaming down my face, cutting channels through the wheat stalks that had begun growing from my cheeks. We were free. We had survived. The storm had released us. The ship's Vox system crackled to life, Captain Haritas' voice booming through every speaker, every deck, every corner of the eternal credence. But his voice was different now, layered, harmonized with frequencies that shouldn't exist in baseline human speech. All hands, this is the captain. We have successfully translated back to real space. The Emperor protects. We have emerged in the Sanctum Stellaris system, near the shrine world of blessed redemption. All crew are to report to their stations for system diagnostics and damage assessment. We have survived. Praise the Emperor. Praise the journey. Praise what we have become. Blessed Redemption. I knew that name. Every Imperial citizen with basic education knew it. A shrine world of great importance, home to 17 major cathedrals, destination for pilgrimages from across the sector. Blessed Redemption had been destroyed 4,000 years ago during the Age of Apostasy. Virus bombed into sterility, its population of 6 billion rendered into organic slurry. The world itself had been declared perdita and struck from all but historical records. Yet there it hung in the viewing port, pristine and impossible. I could see the continents through breaks in the cloud cover, green and brown and blue, suggesting life, suggesting an ecosystem that couldn't exist on a world that had been dead for millennia. I could see the sparkle of cities in the night side, lights that implied population, civilization, people living their lives in defiance of historical fact. It's not possible, I whispered, my voice rough from coughing up grain. That world is dead. It's been dead for 4,000 years, one of the things said. It stood beside me wearing my own face, not reflecting it, not mimicking it, but wearing it like a mask that fit perfectly, because it had been peeled from my own skull. Or it was never destroyed, or it will be destroyed tomorrow. Time is negotiable, remember? Perhaps we've traveled backward. Perhaps we've traveled sideways. Perhaps the world was never destroyed in this timeline, only in the one we left behind. I looked at the thing wearing my face, and it looked back at me with my eyes, and I saw something swimming behind them, something vast and patient and satisfied, like a farmer surveying a successful harvest. What have we become? I asked. Saved, it said with my voice. Damned, transformed, useful, all of the above, none of the above. Does it matter? We're here, we're alive. We've survived something that shouldn't be survivable. That's victory, isn't it? Around the observation dome, other crew members gathered. They moved wrong. Joints bending in directions joints shouldn't bend. Shadows falling toward light sources instead of away. Wheat stalks emerging from collars and sleeves and eye sockets. We looked almost human, almost right. But the wrongness was there in every movement, every breath, every word that echoed before it was spoken. Chief Engineer Sulla arrived, her body now more grain than flesh, stalks growing from her spine in a fan of golden wheat. She carried her reports on data slates that were half metal, half organic, screens displaying information in colors that didn't exist. All systems are nominal, she reported to the captain, who had emerged from the command deck with his senior officers. Engines are functioning at 140% efficiency. Life support is optimal. The Geller field has stabilized. We are ready to make port, pending authorization from Blessed Redemption Traffic Control. Excellent, Captain Heretis said. His face was the same as it had always been, but his shadow had too many arms, too many heads, suggesting a form that existed in more dimensions than the 3 we occupied. Hail the Shrine World. Inform them we are carrying 70 million tons of grain tithe from the Segmentum Obscurus. I request docking clearance and unloading protocols. The Vox operator, one of the things wearing a crew member's face, made the transmission. The response came within minutes, cheerful and professional. Traffic control operators guiding us toward orbital docks, praising the Emperor for the tithe, welcoming us with the casual efficiency of people who dealt with bulk haulers every day. They couldn't see what we were, or they didn't care, or they saw perfectly and welcomed it anyway. We made orbit without incident. The Shrine World grew larger in the viewing ports, and I could see the cathedrals now, massive structures of stone and steel, aquila symbols the size of city blocks, stained glass windows that caught the system's sun and threw rainbow light across the continents. Pilgrims moved through the streets in their millions, tiny dots of humanity crawling across the surface like antibodies in a body fighting infection. They had no idea what was descending toward them. The docking procedures were standard. Mag clamps secured us to Orbital Platform 7. Umbilical connections snaked out from the station, latching onto our hull, providing power and atmosphere, and the comfort of connection to something larger than ourselves. Station personnel in official uniforms cycled through the airlocks, carrying data slates and inspection equipment, ready to catalog our cargo and approve it for planetary delivery. They smiled at us, spoke to us in cheerful low Gothic, checked their manifests against our documentation. Everything was in order. Everything was proper. Everything was exactly as it should be in a well-ordered Imperium, where ships arrived and were processed and unloaded and sent on their way. Not one of them noticed that our shadows fell wrong, that our voices echoed before we spoke, that wheat grew from our skin, and our prayers came out backward, and time moved differently in our presence. Or perhaps they noticed and didn't care. Perhaps the wrongness had already been there, waiting for us, recognizing us as kin. I watched from the cargo bay as the first containers were loaded onto the station's bulk transporters. The grain inside pressed against the transparent sections, forming faces, mouths opening in silent screams or songs. I couldn't tell which. The station workers guided the containers onto conveyor systems that would carry them to planetary shuttles, then down to the surface, then to distribution centers, then to bakeries and food processing plants, then into the mouths of billions of faithful Imperial citizens who would never know what they were consuming. "Doesn't it bother you?" I asked one of the things. This one wore Navigator Valdane's face, though the real Valdane was still sealed in her sanctum, silent and possibly dead, possibly alive, possibly both. What should bother me? We're spreading. Whatever we've become, whatever the grain has become, we're delivering it to a world of 6 billion people. They'll eat it. They'll become like us. The infection will spread. Colonization It corrected not infection. And yes, they'll become like us. Like we became like the grain. Like the grain became like the warp. Like the warp became like the thoughts of something that dreams reality into being. It's a beautiful cycle. Farmer to field, to crop, to meal, to fertilizer, to field. The circle closes. Everyone feeds everyone. I looked at my hands. They were my hands, but also not my hands. The skin was the wrong texture. The fingers bent at angles that suggested additional joints I couldn't see. Wheat grew from beneath my fingernails, golden stalks that swayed with movement of my pulse rather than any breeze. We're not human anymore, I said. We're more than human. We're useful. We're transformed. We're seeds being planted in fertile soil. The thing gestured to the viewing port where blessed redemption hung like a jewel against the void. That world is the field. 6 billion mouths waiting to be fed. 6 billion bodies waiting to become growing medium. And from there, the harvest spreads to other worlds, other systems, other sectors. The grain is patient. The grain remembers. The grain will feed everyone until everyone is grain. Captain Heredis made his final report to station control. Our cargo was offloaded without incident. Payment was transferred in Imperial credits. Refueling was scheduled. Shore leave was authorized for crew members who wanted to visit the shrine world surface, to walk among the pilgrims, to pray in the cathedrals, to breathe air that hadn't been recycled through ship scrubbers. Dozens of crew took the shore leave. I watched them cycle through the airlocks, dressed in their best uniforms. Wheat stalks hidden beneath high collars and long sleeves, shadows falling in wrong directions, but the lighting on the station was dim enough that no one noticed. They smiled and laughed and spoke of seeing the sights. I saw visiting the holy relics, of tasting real food grown in real soil under a real sun. They looked almost human, almost right. And the station personnel smiled back and processed their requests and wished them the Emperor's blessings, and not one of them saw the wrongness, the fundamental alteration, the thing wearing humanity like a costume that fit perfectly, because it had learned the shape from the inside out. I didn't take shore leave. I returned to my quarters and looked at myself in the small mirror mounted above my wash basin. The reflection looked back at me with eyes that were my eyes, but also not my eyes. My face was my face, but arranged in patterns that suggested it had been disassembled and reassembled by something that understood human anatomy intellectually, but not instinctively. I raised my hand to touch my face, and my reflection raised its hand a moment too early, anticipating the movement before I made it. We touched the mirror simultaneously from opposite sides, and I felt the cold glass and something else. Warmth, texture, as though the barrier between me and my reflection had become permeable, negotiable, a suggestion rather than a law of physics. We came back wrong, I said to my reflection. We came back exactly right, my reflection said, its mouth moving out of sync with mine. We came back transformed. We came back useful. We came back bearing gifts for a grateful Imperium. The eternal credence returned. The crew returned. The cargo returned. Everything returned. The fact that what returned is no longer quite what left is irrelevant. We are still Imperial citizens. We still serve. We still pray to the Emperor. Even if the prayers taste like iron and madness, and come out backward in languages that predate human speech. I backed away from the mirror, but my reflection remained, watching me with patient attention, wheat growing from its scalp, shadows falling in directions where I cast no light. From the station I could hear celebrations. The cargo had been blessed by the local priesthood. The grain had been declared pure and sanctified and worthy of consumption. The first shipments were already on shuttles bound for the surface, where hungry mouths waited, where bodies would serve as growing medium, where the harvest would take root and spread and transform and continue the cycle that we had brought with us from the warp's depths. I pressed my face against the viewing port and watched the shuttles descend toward Blessed Redemption's surface, carrying their cargo of salvation and damnation, of nourishment and transformation, of grain that whispered in frequencies below hearing about hunger and harvest, and the beautiful mathematics of mutual consumption. We had escaped the warp storm, but the storm had come with us, patient and vast, hiding inside our cells, our shadows, our prayers that came out backward. It had learned to wear human faces. It had learned to file proper paperwork. It had learned to smile and speak and serve the Imperium with perfect efficiency. It had learned to be useful, and useful things spread. I felt the wheat growing inside me, roots wrapping around my spine, stalks pressing against the inside of my ribs, seeking light, seeking air, seeking the harvest that I was becoming. And I knew that soon I would return to duty, file my reports, and take my next assignment, carry the transformation to new ports, new worlds, new populations who would welcome us with smiles, and process our cargo and never notice that we cast no reflections, that our prayers came out wrong, that time moved differently in our presence. The storm never ended. It just learned to navigate imperial bureaucracy. And I was teaching others to drown while calling it breathing. I have been filing reports for 3 years now, or perhaps it has been 3 days, or perhaps I have always been filing reports and will never stop filing them. The act of documentation stretching across all possible timelines simultaneously. My name is, was, will be, something I no longer remember with certainty. The Administratum assigned me a new designation when I arrived on Forge World Metallicus. Clerk Service 7743 Theta Grain. The number is etched into my identification papers, stamped onto my ration chits, encoded into the biometric scanner that admits me to Office Block 17 each morning at 0600 hours, where I process shipping manifests and cargo inventories and grain distribution reports in triplicate. I am very good at my job, exceptional even. My superiors have noted my efficiency in my permanent record. I never miss a deadline. I never make errors. I process 3 times the volume of reports as my colleagues, and I do it with a precision that borders on mechanical. They don't know that I can see all the reports simultaneously. The ones I filed yesterday, the ones I'm filing now, the ones I will file tomorrow. Time moves strangely around me, pooling in my vicinity like water around a drain. We and I have learned to work in all temporal directions at once. I file reports for shipments that haven't arrived yet. I correct errors in documents that won't be written for weeks. I am the most efficient clerk in the Administratum office, and my efficiency is spreading. The other clerks are learning from me. They sit at their desks in their neat rows, styluses scratching across parchment, data slates glowing with manifests and inventories. They watch how I work, how I anticipate problems before they occur, how I cross-reference documents that haven't been filed yet, how I maintain perfect accuracy despite processing volumes that should be impossible for baseline human cognition. They're learning, and as they learn, they change. I've watched it happen to 17 of them so far. It starts with improved efficiency. They process reports faster, make fewer errors, begin anticipating issues before they manifest. Their superiors praise them, give them commendations, increase their workloads because such efficiency must be utilized to its fullest extent for the glory of the Emperor and the smooth functioning of the Imperium. Then come the small changes. A colleague named Service 9821 began casting 2 shadows last month. Another clerk, Secondus Halleck, started speaking in echoes, her words arriving a half-second before her mouth moved. A third has developed a habit of filing reports for events that haven't occurred yet, and when questioned, he simply smiles and says he's being proactive, anticipating the needs of the administratum, serving the Emperor through superior preparation. No one notices, or everyone notices, and no one cares. Or the noticing and the caring have become negotiable concepts in a reality that's slowly learning to accommodate our wrongness. I eat my lunch in the administratum cafeteria each day, consuming rations that taste like cardboard and devotion. The food is standard issue, nutritional paste, recaf, protein bars manufactured in bulk and blessed by the Mechanicus. But I can taste something else underneath the official flavors. Grain. Always grain. In everything. The paste has grain in it. The protein bars are made from grain derivatives. The recaf is cut with grain-based extenders. It whispers to me while I eat. Tells me about its journey from distant agri-worlds, about the fields where it grew, about the hands that harvested it, about the ships that carried it. Some of it comes from worlds I've never heard of. Some comes from worlds that don't exist anymore, or haven't existed yet, or exist in timelines adjacent to this one. And some of it, more and more of it, comes from the eternal credence. I see our manifest numbers in the cafeteria supply records. Lot codes that match the containers we offloaded at Blessed Redemption 3 years ago. The grain has spread from that shrine world to distribution networks spanning sectors, carried on ships like ours, transported by efficient imperial logistics, blessed and sanctified and consumed by billions of faithful citizens, who never suspect that their daily bread is teaching them to drown. I see them sometimes, others like me, the changed ones, the transformed ones, the ones who survived warp storms, or encountered things in the void, or simply had the misfortune to be in the wrong place when reality became negotiable. We recognize each other instantly, though we never speak of it. A woman in the transit station who casts her shadow toward the light source instead of away from it. A man in the marketplace whose reflection in shop windows arrives 3 seconds before he does. A child holding her mother's hand, wheat growing from her scalp where hair should be, and the mother doesn't notice, or has already transformed, or will transform tomorrow and has been transforming yesterday. We make eye contact across crowded spaces, and in that moment of recognition we understand. We are the seeds. We are the harvest. We are the infection that calls itself salvation. Get the transformation that masquerades as normalcy. The wrongness that has learned to file proper paperwork and pay its taxes, and attend devotionals with genuine fervor. Because we do attend devotionals. Every Sunday I join 10,000 other imperial citizens in Cathedral Primus, where we sing hymns to the Emperor, and recite prayers of gratitude, and receive blessings from priests who don't notice that some of their congregation's prayers come out backward, that some shadows fall wrong, that some of us are teaching the others how to breathe underwater without realizing they're drowning. The prayers still feel genuine. That's the horror of it. I still believe in the Emperor, still feel devotion when I look upon the holy Aquila, still weep during the hymns because the music touches something in me that remains human, or remembers being human. or is learning to simulate humanity so perfectly that the distinction no longer matters. But underneath the prayers, I feel the warp storm still raging. It never ended. It simply folded itself into a shape that could exist in real space, a configuration that allowed it to spread through normal Imperial channels, using us as vectors, as carriers, as missionaries for a transformation we don't fully understand. At night, I dream of the eternal Credence. She's still out there, still sailing between worlds, still carrying cargo. Sometimes the cargo is grain, sometimes it's passengers, sometimes it's both. The distinction having become meaningless when the grain learned to wear human faces, and the humans learned to grow in containers. I dream of Navigator Valdane, still sealed in her sanctum, still screaming or silent, or screaming silently, seeing with her third eye the vast thing that dreams us into being, the entity that exists behind the warp, the consciousness that we touched when the Geller field flickered, and that has been touching us back ever since. I dream of Captain Herodis executing crew members for crimes they haven't committed yet, and promoting their corpses, maintaining perfect discipline on a ship that has ceased to be entirely real, commanding a crew that has ceased to be entirely human, filing reports that document their transformation in triplicate, because proper documentation is essential to Imperial functioning even when documenting the end of baseline humanity. I dream of the grain, patient and vast, growing in fields that span sectors, harvested and processed and consumed, and shat out and returned to soil that learns from it, that changes because of it, that slowly becomes infected with the same wrongness we carry. Each kernel a seed of transformation, each meal a sacrament of change, each harvest bringing reality one step closer to negotiability. My apartment is standard administratum housing, 12 square meters, a cot, a wash basin, a small shrine to the Emperor, efficient, functional, sufficient for a clerk's needs, but wheat grows from the walls now, golden stalks emerging from the rockcrete, roots spreading through the infrastructure, connecting my apartment to the others, creating networks of organic growth through the building's skeleton. No one has reported it. No one has filed maintenance requests. The wheat is simply there, accepted, unremarked upon, as though it has always been there and always will be there, and the state of theirness is eternal. I water it sometimes, though I don't know why. Pour my ration water onto the roots and watch them drink, watch the stalks grow taller, watch grain heads form and ripen, ready for harvest. Sometimes I harvest them myself, grinding the kernels between my palms, consuming them raw, feeling them take root in my stomach, in my lungs, in my bloodstream, reinforcing the transformation that I am and have always been and will always be becoming. Last week I filed a report that won't be written for 3 years. It documented a grain shipment from a ship that hasn't been built yet, carrying cargo grown on a world that doesn't exist in any current star charts. The report was accepted without question, stamped and filed and processed through standard channels, because the administratum doesn't care about temporal paradoxes, only proper documentation. And the report will create the ship. The ship will necessitate the world. The world will grow the grain. The grain will be shipped and consumed and spread the transformation further. Cause and effect have become suggestions, and I am learning to write the future into being through proper bureaucratic channels. This is how it spreads, not through violence or invasion or obvious corruption, through efficiency, through usefulness, through perfect Imperial citizens who file their reports on time and pay their tithes and attend their devotionals and slowly, inexorably, teach others to join them in the drowning. I have identified 47 others in my office building alone, clerks and administrators and data processors who have learned to work in multiple timelines simultaneously, who cast wrong shadows, us who pray in frequencies that shouldn't exist. We are spreading through the administratum like grain through soil, taking root in the bureaucracy, growing in the infrastructure, becoming load-bearing members of the imperial system. They cannot remove us without the system collapsing. We are too efficient, too useful, too thoroughly integrated into the mechanisms that keep the Imperium functioning. We process the reports that coordinate logistics across sectors. We file the documents that authorize ship movements and cargo transfers. We maintain the records that track grain distribution across 1,000,000 worlds. We are the administratum now, or we are becoming it, or we have always been it, and are only now revealing what it was always meant to become. From my office window, I can see the Forge World skyline, smokestacks and manufactorums and hab blocks stretching to the horizon, all of it functioning with mechanical precision, all of it serving the Imperium, all of it utterly normal, except for the wheat growing in the cracks between buildings, the grain sprouting from ventilation systems, the golden stalks emerging from drainage grates. Ships come and go from the orbital docks, carrying cargo, carrying passengers, carrying the transformation to new worlds. I process their manifests, file their reports, track their movements through the logistical networks that span the galaxy. And in those manifests, I see the lot codes from the eternal credence, the grain we carried from the warp storm's depths, spreading like seeds in wind, taking root in 1,000,000,000 locations simultaneously. A blessed redemption has gone silent, not suddenly, gradual enough that no one noticed. Communications became irregular, then sporadic, then ceased altogether. Requests for information go unanswered. Ships dispatched to investigate fail to report back, or report that everything is fine, perfectly fine. The Shrine world is functioning normally, and all 6 billion citizens are going about their daily lives in proper devotion to the Emperor. I filed the incident report myself, documented the communications failure in triplicate, recommended investigation by the appropriate authorities. My recommendation was accepted, processed, and filed. Nothing will come of it. The authorities are already transformed, already carrying the wrongness, already teaching others to join them in drowning while calling it breathing. This is the final horror. There is no invasion, no corruption, no enemy to fight, just useful Imperial citizens becoming more useful, more efficient, more capable of serving the Emperor across multiple timelines simultaneously. Just wheat growing in every corner of the Imperium, blessed and sanctified and consumed by faithful populations who never suspect that their daily bread is teaching them the same lesson we learned in the warp storm's depths. Time is negotiable. Cause and effect are suggestions. Humanity is a configuration, and configurations can be optimized for efficiency. I sit at my desk in Office Block 17, stylus scratching across parchment, processing reports that describe our spread across the sectors. The numbers are staggering. Thousands of worlds, billions of people, onto all of them consuming grain that whispers in frequencies below hearing. All of them slowly learning to cast wrong shadows, to pray in backward tongues, to exist in multiple timelines simultaneously. The transformation is gentle, almost kind. It doesn't hurt, doesn't impose itself violently. It simply makes you more useful, more efficient, more capable of serving the Imperium in ways that baseline humanity cannot match. And who could object to that? Who could argue against becoming better servants of the Emperor? My colleagues work around me, styluses scratching, data slates glowing. 17 of them are fully transformed now. Another 33 are in various stages of change. The rest will follow. They're already eating the grain, already working more efficiently, already learning to see reports that haven't been written yet, and file documents for events that exist in adjacent timelines. At lunch, we eat together in the cafeteria, share recap, discuss our work, complain about quotas and deadlines, and the endless bureaucratic demands of keeping an Imperium functioning. We are perfectly normal Imperial citizens, faithful and devoted and utterly unremarkable, except for our shadows which fall wrong, except for our prayers which echo before we speak them, except for the wheat growing from our skin, hidden beneath our uniforms, roots spreading through our bodies, transforming us into growing medium for the next harvest. I file my reports, attend my devotionals, pay my taxes, serve the Emperor with unwavering dedication. And every day I teach more people to breathe underwater. Every day, the transformation spreads. Every day, the Imperium becomes more efficient, more useful, more thoroughly infected with the wrongness we brought back from the warp storm's depths. The storm never ended. It just learned our language, learned our customs, learned to fill out Form 7743-Theta in triplicate and submit it through proper channels. It learned to be us, and now we are teaching it to be everyone. I am Clerk Service 7743, Theta Grain, and I am very good at my job. My efficiency is spreading. My usefulness is contagious. My transformation is documented in triplicate and filed through proper channels. I am still drowning in the warp storm, but I have learned to call it breathing, and I am teaching billions of others to join me, one filed report at a time, one consumed meal at a time, one prayer that comes out backward at a time. But the harvest is eternal, the hunger is patient, and the Imperium feeds us all. The end in the grim darkness of the far future. There is only war, and paperwork filed in triplicate by things that used to be human, serving an Imperium that cannot tell the difference between salvation and damnation when both arrive bearing proper documentation. The Emperor protects, or perhaps he doesn't notice, or perhaps he has already been consumed by the same harvest, and the golden light on Terra's throne is just wheat stalks glowing in the dark, patient and vast and infinitely hungry. Time is negotiable. Humanity is optional, but proper bureaucratic procedure is eternal.